Thanks, Sally.
Thanks, Helen. So, all of the time and effort that we've put into negotiating and supporting the negotiations have to mean something. But what do we do with those new commitments that emerge from CSW every year? You know, given particularly that a lot of the language isn't new, sometimes it's just put together in different ways, but and we're less and less likely to see new rights, new commitments emerge. But they still have to mean something every year, right? Occasionally we do see steps forward in language as well that do make a difference. So, for example, I remember when I was leading the delegation in the Office for Women, and we took June Oscar with us, who was then a community leader from the Kimberley in Western Australia, to talk about particularly issues for women in remote communities. And her real advice to us and her real advocacy through the course of the CSW that year was to include language around extended kin in ways that the UN hadn't really done before. But because of June's own personal gravitas, it was something that we managed to get into the language, and it should mean something, you know, the way we talk about not just families, but families and in terms of using them as hooks for policy development and further thinking in Australia. But let me tell you, when we come home from CSW as members of government, and particularly as the poor old benighted Office for Women that's always so completely overflown, you kind of have enough time to write a letter to your colleagues across government who have some connection with the agreed conclusions, commend to them the agreed conclusions, and then frankly the caravan moves on. The next thing you move on to is, you know, often International Women's Day, or you know, you might have CEDAW reporting coming up, or you've got contracts to let, you've got, you know, government processes that you've got to engage in. There's really not a lot of time for us to make use of the agreed conclusions and to use them to leverage policy and research outcomes in Australia. So the thinking here, I think, is what can we do? I also know, of course, that NGOs caravan moves forward immediately you return home too, right? You've taken time out to attend CSW, whether virtually or in person, and when you get back, all of your work's piled up and you've got to kind of move on. One of the things that it's important to note in terms of the way government accepts the agreed conclusions when you get home is that, generally speaking, the Commission on the Status of Women works by consensus. It's not a vote process. So when you're negotiating as a member of the government delegation, you might go and check with your colleagues across government if there's something really new or different. But generally speaking, and particularly because we are often recycling language, you don't necessarily go back and check with the Department of Climate Change or the Department of Education if there's something that talks about rights for education. So really, you hopefully have experts in the content of the priority theme with you on the delegation, but you're not going back and checking with them about each piece of language, particularly because as things get to the pointy end in the last 24 hours, it's generally speaking the middle of the night back home, so you can't. So when you land back in Australia, really, that's the first time that the leadership in the departments that are going to be responsible for those agreed conclusions would really have been able to see the detail of them. So we would have had a situation where they would have identified their red lines before you went. These are the things you can't say. We don't want you to go there. But generally speaking, there aren't that many of them. So you're reasonably free to negotiate whatever you want, whatever you reckon seems reasonable when you're over there. And so most of the time, government is happily oblivious to the outcomes of the agreed conclusions and what we've fought so hard for. So how do we bring this home? How do we see this? Rarely would change be significant enough that we have to do anything with it. So, and of course, they're non-binding when you get home. They're kind of commended to government, but they're non-binding in terms of being required to report back against them, except in the very generalist context of the review theme every year. I've rarely heard of courts consulting with Commission on the Status of Women agreed conclusions as part of their consideration of common law cases. Some of you may know that in thinking about, in making decisions about government actions, courts use United Nations language to interpret their government actions on the assumption that governments will act in accordance with convention and treaty obligations unless government makes it specifically clear that they're not going to. So, but that said, I've rarely heard of the CSW agreed conclusions being used as an interpretation tool by courts. And again, the media rarely refers to them. There might be a little bit of a conversation about CSW some years, but in the media, in the public discourse, but generally speaking, it's not something that really attracts a great deal of media attention. So you've got government that really isn't going to pay too much attention to it. You've got the courts that aren't really going to pay too much attention to it. Media, it's up to us. It's up to civil society to make these things really count, I believe. And I think that there's more that we could do, bearing in mind that civil society already is really stretched beyond its own capacity, and we're as resource-starved as the next person. But it may be useful to think about building some time into our calendars on our return to press the case a little bit more with the agreed conclusions. So I always say to NGOs, keep the agreed conclusions close, and particularly if it's an area of your particular expertise, like this year is climate change, of course, then I'd kind of keep them and always remember them so that you can cite them back to your government partners to hold them to account. And they are quite useful as an advocacy tool. Government does pay attention to them. So yeah, I think use them. I think we should maybe think about doing more with the media outcomes, particularly this year in it being a focus on climate change so soon after the Glasgow summit. So I wonder if there's room for us to think about engaging better with the media on return from CSW. And those of us who are involved in the legal process, raise them in public interest litigation as well. I think we need to do better to bring the pressure onto government, because otherwise the government at present is less likely to respond, in my assessment, to pressure from international obligations, to normative pressure, than they were in the past. Do you know, I think when I first started my career in this space, government was a little bit sensitive to what everyone thought of them overseas, and they care less now. I mean, Glasgow's a really interesting example of how we really don't care that much. And Carol has something to add here.
It's actually on that point around, you know, the government doesn't really care what it says internationally. And I want to bring us back to the review years and the big reviews, the big national reviews, where like literally thousands of NGOs, thousands of women's groups, NGOs and feminist groups participate in the national reviews. We did one in 2019. It's an extensive policy document that has clear recommendations to government speaking on the issues. And that is collaboratively developed. So every 5 years, we do those on the review of CSW. And so we have a measurement of how often we are asking the government for this. So we could easily say to government, hey, look, we're asking you for this. We asked you for this 5 years ago. We asked you for this 10 years ago. WTF, what's happening? You know, where's the flower, as they say? So we have already collaborative efforts that we do every 5 years where we have those documents. And I think this is also coming back to Juliana's point about rallying and being very clear about what you're asking for and how you're going to ask for that when you come back, if you get that into the document. So I just wanted to add that. And I think it also shifts a bit of a change on the issue. It can alter, the more you raise an issue, the more it becomes, if we take the gender issue, you know, this gender discussion that we're having at the moment, it was always his and hers. Now it's him, her, they, them. And it's because it's becoming more and more in our own language, we're starting to question and think about it ourselves and how we want to articulate that. And I think, you know, it's the same issue if you carry those forward. It doesn't directly link to action. I think the Beijing reviews link more directly to national action. Because they are a clear national process that shows how you've progressed on a specific issue. But there's opportunities to come back to some of those recommendations and say, how do we implement this? It's in the document, it's an issue. We've raised it the last 10 years. Now let's do something about it. It's those hooks into action. organisations that we have here, like Seroptimists and BPW is not on, but BPW often use that as a mechanism.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, you know, like you say, there is a bit of a moment of power at the moment in terms of thinking in Australia nationally about gender issues, and the government does have some sensitivity to those issues. So I do think that we can use agreed conclusions as part of the pressure that we apply to government to see action happen. There is a real lack of capacity across government, in my assessment at the moment, around gender equality within government and the ability and understanding of government to understand and apply gender equality considerations into the policy work that they're doing. So, you know, there's plenty of room for NGOs to use the CSW agreed conclusion as an educative tool as well. So thinking about just using them when you write to government, attach them and ask them for an update, you know, and my advice is be really specific with the requests that you ask of government. Don't just kind of say, here's the agreed conclusions, what are you going to do about them? Because what you will get back is a whole 2 pages of waffle, you know, or very important, we'll all apply them to everything we do. I would suggest picking out particular clauses and asking government particularly what it's going to do in relation to this piece of the agreed conclusions, in relation to this recommendation, so that you really hold government down and pin them down as much as you can. Look, I do feel that there's it's not a great time for government capacity around gender equality at the moment, but there is plenty of room for optimism. And I just wanted to ask Helen, if I could, to reflect on a couple of the occasions over the last decade or so where we have used the agreed conclusions to leverage outcomes in policy and practice across government.
How smooth was that segue? Quick lower my hand, she's getting to it. Yeah, thanks, Sally, because I think that's a really interesting development from your observation about coming home and picking an area and asking the government specifically what they're going to do about that. From my perspective, what we've done more often, and I think you're right, I think that's something we do need to do. And I think that something that ERA has done more often is raise the agreed conclusions as a nasty shock later on. And the example that's sitting in my head at the moment is the religious discrimination bill that we've just kicked into the bushes, because it was a piece of legislation we really needed. It's been 30 years since we committed people's freedom of thought, conscience and belief, and we still haven't managed it in this country. And yet it was framed in such a way that it was going to materially wind back the Sex Discrimination Act amongst many other discrimination acts around the country. So when we were writing to ministers and to other MPs about the religious discrimination bill, one of the things that I did was directly quoted both the recommendations of the CEDAW committee relating to Australia's reports on our progress on the Convention of the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And I quoted a number of paragraphs from the agreed conclusions that talked about Australia's promise to combat harmful stereotypes of women, because the real risk of the freedom of speech, freedom of religious speech clause in that bill was that it would perpetuate harmful stereotypes of women. And we pointed out both that the bill contravened both the recommendations that the committee had given to Australia about what they needed to do under CEDAW and the promises that Australia had made under the agreed conclusions. And then we pointed out that both processes were about to start again and that we as NGOs would be duty bound to raise this issue if the bill went through. So we used it as a stick in that situation. Now, admittedly, yes, in this political environment, it doesn't have a lot of weight to it, but it adds up. And there are different pressure points at different times. So Australia hasn't made a voluntary national report under the Sustainable Development Goals for years and years and years. We're supposed to do it sort of every 4 years-ish. I think it's been 7 years. There's a point where it's going to become slightly politically embarrassing for them. And somebody somewhere as a ticker box exercise is going to say, yeah, we're going to need to do that. And at that point, ERA will start using the Sustainable Development Goal language in the lead up to that process to say, this is happening, there will be some scrutiny on you, it will be international, but it will also be local, and we will be duty bound to raise this thing that you're doing currently. So we use it as a sword, as well as a monitoring tool when we're in the middle of the work we're doing. One of the things we also do when we've got a government that has a little bit more reactiveness to international pressure is that we will sometimes map the things that we're reporting on against the international standards. So if we're doing a pre-budget submission, we might map our housing ask. For example, we might be asking for a national strategy on housing and homelessness in Australia. And we might start by saying which accords with, and then list Article 25 of the UNHDR, and then ISCA, and then all the rights, and then all the articulations of the right to housing, and then the various paragraphs that we've agreed to on the agreed conclusions. And we'll attach that as an annex to a document. Once you've done it once, you just keep bringing it out. And so one of the things I think is critical is that none of us has to do the work of implementing all of the agreed conclusions in Australia. We can all do a little bit, and hopefully we can identify which areas that haven't got anyone working on them and help our sisters to work in those areas as well. But for example, if if the ERA says we want to do housing and economic security for women and women's leadership and role in decision making, which are our sort of funding areas, then we will, when we come out of an agreed conclusion process, we'll sit down and pick out the paragraphs that are most useful to us, put them under those headings, and then every time we churn something out, we have the ability to just slot them in. Even if it's just references to them or as an annexure or something like that. In practice, we only do it where it's a big document and where it's a document that's happening in an environment where we think the pressure will work. But we're looking at something where there is already quite a bit of opposition or a bit of noise. Adding the agreed conclusions or the treaty or the recommendations of a treaty committee, it's the sort of thing that the media quite likes to pick up on. They quite like and it contravenes a promise they've already made. It's the sort of tone of outrage they quite like in the media. And so some of our media around the religious discrimination bill did focus on that issue of the fact that we are about to report under CEDAW, and yet we're looking at winding the Sex Discrimination Act backwards for the first time in its history. And the ugliness of that, I think, does hit home. So I think it's worth doing.
And interestingly, I remember, Helen, when we first established the alliances and you were a tiny little tot convener of ERA and I was the head of Office for Women. And, that's what, 15 years ago now, is it? 12 years ago. And how many heads of Office for Women have you been through? Maybe you're up to number 10 now, right? So
something like that. Yeah.
I think that it's worth remembering that often public servants cycle through and they haven't got the depth of experience that we all do, right? And particularly Helen, who as a linchpin in the alliances, have a really strong influence to exert over government to help them to educate themselves as well. So sometimes the work that we do in preparing for CSW and providing support to government to negotiate the agreed conclusions by mustering all of the language in this particular priority area and having it at your fingertips is really important as well when you come home, because you can use it in that way to hold government to account, to ask specific questions of them. And very specific questions, I think, are important in that space. And I think that we have those access to those resources that poor government bureaucrats often don't have. I can tell you that the systems aren't what they need to be. You can find them if you search, but you've got to know what you're looking for. There's no deep compendium of international agreed conclusions or international language that has been agreed in some forum. And there's few people who really are familiar with an expert in international processes. So remember that NGOs and CSOs actually have the information that government might need. So using it effectively, as kindly where you need to and pointedly where you have to, is really a useful thing. Helen?
Yeah, and Sally, can I just follow on from that to say that ERA is in a bit of a privileged position as one of the National Women's Alliances in terms of talking directly to government. But there's a flip side, I think, to using the agreed conclusions, and I might pass to Juliana after this to talk more about this, which is if you are operating in a grassroots environment, I think it might be very, very powerful to be a woman in a marginalised community who learns that women around the world are pushing for the same thing she is. And that she's not being presumptuous and she's not being uppity, she's just asking for the basics, and that she should feel empowered to do that. Juliana, is that something you've had experience of?
Could we come to this in a minute, Helen? I had a kind of a thought that we would finish the conversation about how we first of all engage with government and pause and ask some questions. And then I think the other ways that agreed conclusions are really useful is, as you say, as an educational piece, and particularly to empower grassroots and community women. So could we come to that in a minute? But it is a really important part of it. And so I thought I might just ask, before we move on to that piece, talk to Carol about how we've used agreed conclusions in informing the development, for example, of national action plans or national plans. We've got a number of them in Australia at the moment around things like trafficking, violence against women, peace and security, and of course the language is important for finessing the positions that government takes in terms of developing its policy priorities in that space. Is that something, Carol, that you might talk to?
I can talk a little bit to it. I think I have to say up front, though, I feel that often national action plans, while they're a really good thing to have, can depoliticize an issue. And I just want to put that on the table because we're seeing that now with the violence against women pieces. The one that I have most experience of has been women, peace and security, and a lot of that has been to bring the government on the journey with you in the thinking of how that develops, and to share with them the integration of how important it is to have civil society voice reflected in that. The structures of state, I think the key thing that I would say around that is go in with high expectations, go for what is absolutely the best thing to do, because you know it's going to get slashed in half by the time it gets through government. You know, you can have as many consultations and come up with the best ideas, but by the time it's gone through, you know, 2 or 3 government departments, and then the ministers had a look over it, and then it's come back again. That's fine, and then you might have a change of government, and with, for example, with Women, Peace and Security, the white paper that one prime minister writes is suddenly written off, and you have to write up another. But I think that the consistent messaging across different areas and across the agenda, so certainly with the Women, Peace and Security, the consistent, what do they call it, the persistent way of continuously keeping the right language in to highlight the issues has been what's got it. I don't think that's really answering your question, but I think that's kind of where I land with that. You know, using to get a national action plan. Would we have had a national action plan on violence against women if it hadn't been suggested at the UN? Is a question mark. I don't know, but I know that Australia thinks about these things before going in, and so there is the opportunity to speak to government on those parts and suggest and build a body of interest in a national action plan before, and then use those pieces from the various commitments. So I mean, when we did the Women, Peace and Security, it wasn't, you know, there's a lot of looking at who else has done national action plans, how did they look, what did they reflect, how have they reflected the language in different countries from the different conventions, treaties, issues, and how do you adapt something that's for the international arena to the national arena? I think that's the big piece of work that we have to do in bringing it back into something like that. But there's certainly a lot of information and points you can use from CSW outcomes as well as other international areas. Does that answer?
I think that's a really important.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important point, to use the same language wherever you can consistently, so that government is kind of acculturated to it and expects it. And certainly when we wrote the first National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, it was really important to note who'd already done, well, there was a recommendation in 1325, the Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, that governments develop national action plans. And when we were thinking about convincing our ministers to do it, it was really important to us to look at who'd already done them and, you know, was this the gang we wanted to be in? And yes, it was. So that kind of helps to progress that decision. And I'll really pick up the point that Helen made, that government is sensitive to international comparisons and recommendations, but particularly it's sensitive to those where Australia's named, actually. So CEDAW recommendations to Australia about areas where we're falling short are really important in terms of generating progress. So you can, if you kind of hook it into a recommendation, your recommendation to government into a recommendation from the committee, the CEDAW committee, and cite all of the relevant agreed conclusions and treaty language, then I think that can really help to build a case for movement. Certainly when years and years ago, when I was at the Human Rights Commission and we were starting the conversation, a campaign around paid parental leave, paid maternity leave in those days, it was really important to our work to be able to tell government that we're one of only, at that stage, 4 OECD nations that didn't have some form of paid parental leave, us, New Zealand, US, and I can't remember the fourth one, but that meant something to the Australian government. They didn't want to be out in the cold. So I think recognising where you can point to the Australian government being a laggard is a really important way of approaching the government to get movement to happen. And so as specific as possible where there's a, you know, Australia's being named and shamed, that's super important. And like you say, Helen, I think that's also a really important hook for media. So we do have a more engaged and educated media now around international and gender issues. And I think that we can help them as well to build their capacity around understanding where Australia stands internationally. And like you say, they love those conflict stories. If they can do a gotcha on the government and tell the government that we're a laggard or that we're an outlier, is really important for the media as well. So I think that there's this, the one prong of our fork with agreed conclusions is to use it as an impetus towards policy change, to use the levers that it presents with a range of actors to help us to prompt action through government to make policy change. And then there's the other piece that Helen alluded to, that is around the education of the community, so that the community feels itself empowered. And, you know, when I was working in international development, I'd often wonder what was the point of all of the international normative work that we do in CSW and CEDAW and, you know, and treaty bodies and things. And I would sort of think that it was a little bit ivory castle and not that real. But when in my development work particularly, to speak to women whose life had been changed by knowing that they had rights, you know, they'd been raised not thinking that they had any rights, not thinking that they mattered, not thinking that they had any recourse for any crimes that they suffer or offence or oppression that they live with. And to hear women who've had access to an exposure to some kind of understanding of their international human rights and seeing how that changed their lives was a really important piece, I think. And I agree with you, Helen. I know that Carol and Juliana have a lot of experience in this space. Did you have any stories or experiences that you wanted to share, Juliana or Carol, about this?
I think Juliana and I have a shared experience on this, where a certain minister heard one story at CSW, someone who shall not be named but has a perfect hairstyle. So she heard a story from a young woman who was affected by FGM, and the minute she got back, it opened the door to that whole discussion that Juliana and I initially went into, and then Juliana picked up around, you know, FGM as a national issue in Australia and how is it being dealt with. And at that point, it was Juliana, I mean, this is your area of work, but at that point, it was FGM was dealt with at the state level and was bitty, and there wasn't a you talk to that part.
Well, look, I think it was like nothing had happened in Australia about FGM. So let's just get into this thing. And we had to hold it down for her and make her understand that you actually have funding that goes to different states through the health system, the health partnership agreement on FGM. So, you know, you can calm down and help us to achieve the things that we want to achieve on the ground. That is the power of CSW for you. But I think, Sally, the issue about using the CSW agreement as a tool for education for the community is something that I don't think we have completely achieved in Australia, because I think when we listen to people from other regions, so I will reflect to you on the African region. A lot of the people who get the privilege to attend CSW from African countries are mainly people who work in NGOs, and they take that process extremely seriously, and they return to their countries and ensure that they continue the linkage with the regional groups, and they use those agreements as a tool of education at the grassroots level, and ensure that they are constantly using the language with their government and their policymakers. Whether the policymakers will listen or not, as much as it's on the ground with the community, there's a groundswell, and that groundswell gets up into government. That process I do not see as taking place in Australia. I'm very sorry. I'm going to put it on this platform. It is recorded, and those are my words. In case I don't come back next year, please note these words. Australian NGOs and Australian normal women on the streets don't understand anything about the Beijing Platform for Action. People on the streets in African countries do. The woman on the marketplace with her baby at the back, with her cloth tied, with her luggage on her head, knows something about Beijing Platform for Action, because they can refer you to that and refer you to the fact that it is my right, and therefore I expect my government to do something about it. Whether they do it or not is not the issue. The issue is that they understand their rights. We don't care about our rights in Australia because we think it's a given. All the wins that have been made go by, you know, they go right by, because it's like, oh, it's our right. That's what we have. This is our situation. You know, when you don't exercise your muscle, it atrophies. When we don't make use of these along the way, we're going to lose ground. And unfortunately, we are probably at risk of losing ground on a lot of spaces. So my call out today, my call out to women of Australia is get involved, show some kind of interest in gender equality issues, because at the end of the day, we might be right back where we started from, and that is so unfair. So how do we do that? How do we do that? As the person who holds an NGO agenda, I ensure that people begin to think and hear about what CSW is. In my organization, in the organization I work for, the first question I asked when I got in and people were talking about sending a young woman to CSW was, what for? Do you really understand what this is about? Why are you sending her there? What is she going to do? What's she coming back with? The issue that Carol taught me when we were talking to the African women about the whole process of going to the international level was the issue of responsibility and mandate. So if you go, you come back and you report back. What is our reporting back process?
Yeah.
Do we have one?
And particularly reporting back to our NGO stakeholders, but more broadly, and I think, Juliana, you've raised a really important set of issues in there. Number one, that women, particularly young women in Australia, or women on the street in Australia, don't feel the need to rely on international human rights language because they feel that our rights through our domestic law should be sufficient. And as we know, they're often not. And as we know, there are often threats to the domestic framework that the international law can be a bulwark against, as Helen was just saying in relation to the Sex Discrimination Act, number one. And then second of all, I think there's a reason why internationally there's a lot more attention paid to sharing information with women in the streets. And that's because of, thanks to development funding. Do you know, there's a lot of development funding that goes into developing nations that results in sharing information. It's seen as important in development in ways that it's not seen as important in the Australian context. And, we all remember that the Millennium Development Goals were focused on only developing nations and didn't apply to developed nations like Australia. So Australia felt itself completely off the hook, but we use the MDGs all the time to leverage and pressure developing government partners to do better in terms of gender equality and human rights issues that we didn't do ourselves. And so just as an aside, a tale, when I was in DFAT as the head of the gender equality piece, while we were negotiating the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, I wasn't part of the direct negotiations across government, but I was part of the DFAT working group, and I would occasionally remind our negotiators, have you told Indigenous Affairs and your Australian government colleagues that this is going to apply to their work too? And they would say, we've told them. They don't realise it's going to bind them. And it didn't touch the sides really for government until the SDGs landed. And then everybody went, oh, okay, so we've got to report too. I think this is a real risk for the SDGs, because if all developed nations don't take these commitments seriously, then the whole thing will fall down, right? So will developed nations also say, well, why should we do it if you're not doing it? So this was the risk around the universalisation of the SDGs compared to the Millennium Development Goals. And anyway, the fact is that we haven't done a great deal in Australia to domesticate or bring home the Sustainable Development Goals, whereas a lot of developing nations have done, and because they were set up to do so following the Millennium Development Goals. So I think that's a really interesting thing, that Australia doesn't really see it has a role in supporting grassroots community organisations to share information and knowledge about international human rights law and practice with their communities, because we see it's not something that we have to do. It's something that developing nations need to do, because those women are the ones that need help. So I think there's two bits in there about why there's this level of ignorance in Australia generally, Juliana, about international human rights frameworks. And there's a reason why so many people who participate in CSW, like me, sort of older women who've got time and who've learned about it over the course of years, rather than it being driven by young people. It's great to see the young people around this virtual table today, but I think we really need to do better at building and bringing more young people to the table so that they can use it as part of the way of building their passion and sharing their life path as well. So I'd love to hear from people around this table now about how they see us going in terms of sharing that information. And I can see Sandra saying, yeah, we try. It's not for want of trying, right? But there's very little government funding. And it's hard to find the space. Are there any thoughts about what has worked to use international human rights frameworks to build capacity and passion and knowledge and empowerment in Australian communities?
I think this was the idea behind the generation equality. We touched on that earlier this morning, that generation equality was supposed to be bringing the younger voice and mobilising. And I notice Alice is on, and I know she wasn't in charge of this in IWDA, but IWDA was one of the key focal points to rally groups around the generation equality. I think the unfortunate thing that's happened with that is, and as I said earlier, is COVID hit, and suddenly we're in a virtual space. So I don't know if you want to say something on that, Alice, around that mobilisation and the impact that maybe the last couple of years have had on it.
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on what you said, Carol, I do think COVID made it tricky. I noticed this even with CSW. It's much easier to get energized about it when you're traveling, and maybe the travel is, part of the appeal. But, if we could have taken 100 young Australian women or women from across Asia and the Pacific to Paris or Mexico City for the Generation Equality Forum meetings, you've got a big group of people who are energized. They're telling people you can get media coverage. We could not get a single story placed about generation equality, and we tried really, really, really hard. We had a media comms consultant who pitched to every single news outlet in Australia, and we couldn't get it covered. And there's a lot of reasons. The COVID outbreak in Sydney was ramping up. This was like May, June last year. But it is really tough. And I think COVID is part of it. I think generation equality had other challenges that probably contributed to that as well. But yeah, since I've got my microphone on, I'm going to throw in a controversial opinion on raising awareness of.
We're recorded, just so you know.
It's not that controversial. It's it's controversial because I don't work in the domestic space. I work in the international space, and something I find really fascinating about CSW and other international spaces is that they are spaces where Australia pushes for progressive global commitments on things that we are not necessarily doing in Australia and do not necessarily align with cabinet ministers' positions. The government as a whole, they might be government as a whole positions, but they're not the sort of like big P politics, you know, what's being talked about on talkback radio, what politicians are being interviewed on. There's real divergence between those two things. And so to some degree, I think that actually serves us really well, because it means Australia is out there advocating for progressive commitments on issues that, if significant attention was brought to that fact, they might stop doing. So that's my controversial opinion, is that, you know, I think that there's value in obviously making people aware of the ability to advocate through these forums and bring their issues. But I do think that there's a trade-off in increasing public awareness and sort of like, you know, public debate on some of these things, because I think Australia is kind of one of the better countries in these spaces, and my suspicion is that more attention would lessen what we do rather than increase it.
I think that's a really important point, actually, Alice, to make and to remember and to bear in mind that often the things that we do in international spaces fly under the radar, and when they don't, as in Glasgow, that had significant attention, that's when you run into strife in the domestic policy space. But there's a strong argument, I think, and one that I think DFAT relies on, that, you know, governments go like this, they change their complexion, they go, you know, left and right, up and down. But it's important that in Australia's stance internationally, that we kind of smooth out those ups and downs, if you like, that Australia needs to be seen in a reasonably consistent fashion, consistent with the changes in policy by government. And so, you know, often there's this kind of smoothing out of the lumps and bumps and ups and downs. And I think that's worth bearing in mind, but that's quite a reasonable thing to do. And I know that we've got Claire Moore here. Claire, did you have anything to contribute in that space, having been there yourself?
I was rarely in government, Sally. That's the frustration in terms of what, you know, the discussion around how you attract attention around issues like this, and amidst the other things that are, you know, taking up people's minds. As you know, I've been almost obsessed with the SDG agenda, and that was a term that was actually used about me. I was obsessed with it, and you've actually reinforced in today's discussion, you just cannot get any hook around SDGs in the domestic format. It's always focused on international situations. As has just been said, we tend sometimes to be much more outraged about what happens overseas than what happens at home. So,
yeah,
I know this is being recorded, so I've got to.
I mean, and this is something that we run into as feminists, I think, quite often, don't we? That people accuse us of being concerned about micro issues here in Australia when, you know, look at what's happening to women in Afghanistan, as though there's only one priority that anybody can have at any one stage, rather than thinking about this as a global movement. So I think that's really true. I see that because we've had our small break, given the timing, I see that we're sort of moving ourselves into session 5, Helen, if that's okay. We might just continue to raise some of the issues that are emerging from session 5 and pick up the other issues as we go through this conversation. And so I think in the last session of the day, we were planning to talk about the past, current and future involvement, and where CSOs go from here in terms of thinking about how we engage with the international human rights space, looking at the closing space, looking at, I think you've spoken already about the movement to a digital platform and the change that introduces for NGOs, and thinking about the history of Australia's CSO engagement in New York with the Australian delegation, and where do we go from here. So I think we've sort of framed up in the earlier conversation that we've had so far some of the challenges that we face and some of the opportunities that we have. And so the next question for us is, and so where do we go from here, and how do we make use of the opportunities that the digital space present us, but also I think importantly, as Alice mentioned, the travel bit does inspire, doesn't it? You know, it's something that you'll always remember. It, as Carol and Juliana said, builds those lifetime friendships. It carries with it a power that engaging online doesn't, even if there's more accessibility for us. So there's kind of swings and roundabouts with all of this, and to think about how we raise the power for international human rights processes and gender equality processes on a digital or a hybrid space is a real question for us as we go forward, I think. And secondly, you know, we've raised the notion that we have lost capacity across government to understand and to use international human rights and gender equality frameworks. So how do we change it from here? We've raised the question that, you know, Australian community work doesn't engage with international human rights processes as much as it should. And I think it was it Tony that pointed out that that there's some good work happening in Australia with the ACT in particular, focusing on civics education in schools, but it doesn't necessarily rely on the international human rights framework for that work. So thinking about those challenges with opportunities and where are the opportunities and where are the challenges and what do we do about those challenges is, I think, the thing that would be really useful for us to think about as we wrap this conversation up. Yeah, so I'm happy to kind of open here for questions as to where we've come to so far, or comments or thoughts or inputs before we move into that final session, or we can just keep on moving. Are there any thoughts people would like to share in that space?
Well, I've always got an opinion, but this is something that I reflected this to Helen yesterday, and I've been rethinking this whole thing because I'm really big on you know, shrinking civil society space, which we've been watching and seeing, and there's, you know, in doing that, there's other spaces opening. So Alice and I were in a conversation with the negotiator of the working methods document, which we probably wouldn't have had if, you know, things had been as they were, you know. So other spaces are opening. I've also been speaking to Bobby Trower at the Y, and the way that her digital space has opened up the space for conversations for young women across the region. So it's no longer limiting those discussions. This, you know, the online environment's no longer limiting discussions or safe discussions to a national context. They're opening up that to be able to compare and ask. And even at the regional level, you know, the Asia Pacific's turning to Africa, and we're hosting joint consultations now through the digital means that we would never have been able to afford before. So on the one side, I think there's an awful lot of space that's happening, and it's about how do we harness that and bring it into a way that we can use all of these different conversations and, you know, collaborate. The other side to it is the space is definitely closing, and, you know, even at the regional level, in the Beijing reviews every 5 years, and for the high level political forum every year, they've been funding people to, you know, civil society to come together at a regional level face to face, and they've already said that that kind of funding is just not going to be available in the future as they move forward. And so to one extent, COVID has stopped a practice that was useful for coming together, and it's become the sort of excuse to not come together. And this post-COVID world is going to have to be what we make it and what we push for. So I think in the area of shrinking space, we have to be constantly vigilant and monitoring around that. The other thing that's happened is at the national level, it's all the space to discuss with the Office for Women has really opened up. You know, we've got a collaboration happening now that we didn't have 5 years ago, which, you know, is fabulous. You know, so it's sort of trying. It's a funny area. It's such a messy space, and you know. What's going to happen with this methods of work, and we touched on why it's important to look at the methods of work and to be part of that discussion, is governments themselves don't want people in the room because they cause problems. You know, civil society cause problems. So is the next step, and this is what we have to be ever vigilant of, is the next step they're going to stop CSOs on delegations? You know, so that it's almost like a predictive forward-backward dance that we're doing, that we're having to constantly look at the space, but recognize that the online environment's created a whole new space. And how do we utilize it better?
Thanks, Carol, and we'll come back to some of those things, but should we just quickly have a 5-minute break? I can see there's a couple of people who are looking for a stretch, a break, a drink of water, a cup of tea. So should we have another 5 minutes before we finish off the last of the afternoon? Thanks, everybody. Come back in 5. you reckon we're good to go now, Helen? Is that 5? Yep. Okay, I'll carry on. So I was really struck by some of the things that you said, Carol, in your conversation before we had a quick break there. You said the collaboration with Office for Women now we have collaboration with Office for Women now that we didn't have 5 years ago. Are you able to explain a bit about that and why you think that's so, and what opportunities that raises for us?
Yes. Okay. So Sally, you and I met way back in B5, so we go a long way back in these processes. And I've been part of the national reviews basically since Beijing. So B5, B10, B15, 20, now just 25. Please, I don't want to do 30. Somebody else do it. I'll advise. It's a lot of work and it's a lot of collaborative. But in doing that, the approach that we've had, it's been a consistent group of people that's been engaged. We know who it is, and we've had an opportunity to go to the Office Women each time, and really and we did it when you were in office as well, Sally. We went to the office, we said, we want to do this review. This is what we're doing. We're doing it whether you want us to or not. Sometimes it's been funded and supported. The last few years it hasn't. The last couple of times it hasn't. But it's opened a door for Office Women to say, oh, well, I know somebody, when it comes on the desk, let's just ring and find out what the updates are. And often, as civil society, we're in all these different processes and we're hearing things. We're at meetings at midnight. All the New York meetings are at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning for those of them who are attending them. We're there at midnight and we're hearing what's happening, and the next morning we're talking to Office Women and they haven't heard it because it hasn't come through from the mission yet. So there's a lot of sharing that has gone on in the last few years, but especially since the last review, when we got a new Office Women, there was a whole rotation, so it was everybody was new in that space and nobody knew what they were doing, and so there was a reliance on us. And then we had a regional meeting. So Beijing 25 had the meeting in Thailand, which a lot of us were at. And that offered an opportunity to build the relationships and to really say, look, we're working together here. Like, we want the same thing. It's not, we're not evil. We're scary women, but we're not evil. We actually want the same thing. So how can we best collaborate to do that? And often, it's like with all things, the governments can't always say what they want to say. There's a conflict there of what the government says and what the people themselves want, women on the delegations want. And we can say that in a different way and get it still heard. So I think there's the way that we're working now, and partly because we're all online, is it's been very difficult to get hold of the zero draft in the past. Now, when I've been involved in this for a long time, so a lot of my zero draft comes direct from New York, as it's happening because of the people who are there and the relationships you build. But now, the government is saying to us proactively, we want to have this conversation with you. We know that this is the date it's coming out. This is how we're working. How do you want to, it's been really, really good the last few years, and they've been very open, and we've seen the language we've put forward carried through to the UN. And I think that, given where we're at internationally with the global pushback and the push from the right, it's really good that we can talk to our own governments and at least get those changes and agreements happening at the national level. So, that's what I would say around that, because, whoever they take on, in the delegation is the right person for the job at the time. And I think that needs to be supported, and we have to recognize that, it's pretty tough being an NGO on the delegation, because you can't say anything, you can't do anything, but you're there and,
Look, there's a lot of points I'd really like to pick back up again, Carol, in what you just said. But before we do, I just wanted to flick to Margarita, picking up on the point that you made in the chat, Margarita, about the position, about the way young people feel that it can be a bit overwhelming when you're faced with people who've been doing this for decades. Are you able to share with us your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I first want to begin by saying that I completely hear the point about kind of on the ground, the issues being more important, and young people kind of wanting to advocate for international issues as opposed to national issues that affect us. I think that when we talk about young people in the international sphere, a lot of us feel like we don't belong, it's not our place. And even on that national level, there's a very big disconnect between the privilege of people who, well, I'm going to say young women for this, in this instance, the privilege of young women who might have corporate connections through their parents or whatever, or government connections, in the sense that those are the kind of women who are more involved in the kind of national issues and wanting to, I guess, advocate for the stuff that is happening on the ground. And in some senses, bringing up the issues internationally in a way where it's like, you know, I'll advocate in the way that I can, or I'll attend this action or this event, seems like the only accessible way to get into human rights at all. Especially in Australia, I think that because it is a tight-knit community, there's a bit of privilege of information, as there always is with UN things, obviously, the language, the way that it's accessible. But as a young woman in the sphere, sometimes it's super intimidating, and I don't even feel like it's my place to be able to speak, or my place to want to get involved, because I don't have the knowledge, I don't have the information, I don't have any of it. So I know that myself and my peers often stick to trying to advocate to, you know, international issues that, you know, we might not be a part of because we can't get involved here on the ground.
I wonder if I can flick to Shenna as well. I noticed you said, Shenna, that you know, you're only now coming to the international space 10 years after you started working with organisations like the Y, etc. And can you tell us a bit about your journey there and what you saw the barriers were, and what pathways you think we might be able to do better with to kind of bring young women along?
Thanks, Sal. And it's been a really, there's so much to absorb, which I think is kind of testament to how much richness there is in this space that, you know, is within certain rooms. I will say, living on Ngunnawal land, on Ngambri land, and actually being in Canberra was a huge privilege that made it accessible to be in these conversations, literally being in the same building as ERA. I think was one of the ways that I was able to you know, get introduced to these sorts of conversations. I think some of the practical examples that Helen mentioned before around how CSW and international mechanisms are used by organizations to then lobby is quite clear. And I wonder if there's ways that you can translate that to, what does this mean for me as, you know, someone who cares about gender equality but doesn't have any connections or networks or tools to actually harness that energy. Because there's so much information. And I think what you said, Sal, before around, don't just ask government, what are you going to do about this? What are the key clear asks? Maybe if there's a way of, well, what are the frameworks and structures that people can get involved in? And what are the small practical actions that people can take? Like obviously joining an NGO membership organization or something like that. I know Amnesty International, that, you know, a lot of young people that I've seen over the years get involved with that. They did get involved in locally based things, volunteering at their schools, doing human rights education through that space. So it's not to say that there aren't grassroots things happening and people aren't engaged in this, but maybe again, it's also like the silos of where are the commonalities in different movements, in different climate change movements and feminist movements, where can we kind of build those bridges, I think is probably an important thing as well. But in terms of young women and young people, I think it was Carol, you mentioned the digital space. It's important because I definitely have seen, at least from my experience over the last 10 years, a lot of young women that I met was predominantly from Canberra or Melbourne or Sydney. So very major city, capital city focused. And so, I think rather than having people try and find us, like actually listening and opening the doors of like, well, where young people exist, whatever the last census is going to say around the population, young people exist. So where are they, and where yeah, I think it's that listening, exchange, conversation that's needed, which starts with building trust. So yeah, Mary.
And you're definitely there, like young women are there, you know, it's how do we connect it? You know, I just heard you talking about the rural spaces. I know that they're really active in the rural spaces, and we've got no one from Rural Women here today to talk on that, but they have a really active voluntary network that talks about all of this. So how can we connect it? It's you know, that's the key thing. And I just want to do a bit of a qualifier on the language stuff and some of the work that happens with the Office Women is there's not always the opportunity to suddenly send that out to, you know, 50, 20 people and get an input back because they want turnaround on language on a 14-page document in 2 hours. So you need to have specific targeted knowledge that, you know, and that's that trust that's happened with the office. But that doesn't mean to say that there isn't other ways that, I mean, you know, there's, and this is what annoys me about the shrinking spaces. When I was at the University of New South Wales, I would take students to the UN, to CSW, to observe the negotiation process, because there's nothing better than observing it. So if we could push for an observation position that would allow people to observe, you understand automatically what's happening and how to track the different conversations and how it all feeds together. And this closing space is stopping those opportunities. And, you know, some of the rich opportunities that I had as I was coming up to just sit back and go, oh my God, I know nothing, and be surrounded by people who knew everything is terrifying. Don't think I don't still know it, because I'm still talking to those people and they still terrify me, right? We're all scary women, but we're very approachable and open. And I'd love to find a way that we can, you know, we've hinted to this all the way through, that there seems to be a role for, you know, a growing voice of bringing those voices together, even if it's a, you know, I don't know, but it's going to be in the digital space for the next while. And I do think it's opened up a lot of that.
It's an opportunity. Can I ask Heidi or Marley, from the point of view of WIDA in particular, you know, WIDA and women with disabilities more broadly have been really closely involved with international gender equality processes ever since I've certainly been around, and have been really engaged. Can I ask how you see, you know, well, first of all, how did that happen? How did an organisation like WIDA get itself so kind of canny in terms of the international human rights space, gender equality space? And second of all, how do you see the barriers and the opportunities, and particularly opportunities in terms of the new hybrid or digital engagement? Can I get your perspective on that?
I'm happy to try and answer this. I'm sorry, I've just come back from an appointment, so I'm not on my best game. I think Heidi can maybe speak to a little bit more of the history on how we have become so engaged in those processes, but I honestly think a lot of it is to do with Carolyn acting as our CEO, because Carolyn has a really large skill set and knowledge base, and often has worked as a technical expert for these different processes. And I think by extension that has led to WIDA's involvement further. But I think to the fact that WIDA is explicitly set up as a human rights-based organisation, and I know that we have ECOSOC accreditation, which allows us to send delegates and engage with different processes, especially on the CRPD, has been really helpful. I think the online transfer is great. I think earlier in the day when Helen mentioned the concept of time zone justice, I was like, go off, I love that. Because I know me and Heidi did try to engage in a lot of the NGO CSW events last year. And so many of them looked wonderful, and like we made accounts, we registered for these events, but they were on like 2:33 in the morning. So I think I didn't really attend anything. So I think it's a bit hard to answer how well the accessibility of it being online is translated, because it's kind of still not accessible, because it's, yeah, just totally out of our time zone reach. barriers to engaging there. I totally echo what Margarita was saying. So I feel like I've come into the conversation halfway through, but like, yeah, I feel like I would not be in this space right now if I had not moved from a very rural New South Wales to Canberra for uni. Like that is being on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land is the only way that I entered this space, which is concerning to me, but but yeah, I do agree that as a young woman, it can be really intimidating to be engaging in these conversations. But yeah, Heidi,
Did you
have more to add?
Not a lot, to be honest. I mean, I can't really speak to how WIDA got involved in, I guess, developed its status as a human rights organisation I think that's very much a Carolyn question and probably comes back to, I don't know, just Carolyn's strong commitment to using human rights frameworks in submission writing and engaging with other international organisations like Women Enabled International. In terms of accessibility for young people, I would say that although pivoting online has meant more people can kind of attend and engage, I would agree with Marley that the time zone difference just makes it almost impossible. But also that it really hasn't changed the inaccessibility of things, and it has almost increased inaccessibility in forms of the inaccessibility of language and the way these processes kind of go about. Like, I know that for me, I've never been to CSW in person. I did go to COSP in person once, which is the Conference of State Parties on the CRPD. And I found that attending in person actually made me understand so much better what was going on. Whereas CSW, I still feel like I have no clue, even though I've technically attended online twice. And yeah, I actually do feel like that's the biggest issue for young people, the language around these kind of processes and how it's so different to what we use in everyday life. And it's almost done, I feel like it's almost done in a way that's intentionally inaccessible to the everyday person, so that, I don't know, there's this like hierarchy where governments can speak to each other without anyone else understanding what they're saying. Like, you can understand if you really look into it, but yeah, I mean, on top of that, I would say that obviously we're also privileged in belonging to these organizations. Like myself, as technically a young person still, the only reason I'm involved is because I'm a staff member of WIDA. There's no way I would be here or in any way really ever I wouldn't really ever know about what CSW even is, or ever consider attending, if I wasn't. So yeah, I think that's another barrier, but I don't really know how to address that.
Okay, thank you. Helen.
Yeah, just to jump in on that, because I think that raises a number of other issues that are actually opportunities in some ways, because I learnt the vast core of what I know about CSW by being directly mentored by Caroline Lambert, another giant in this area, and have gone on learning all the way from people like Carol and Juliana and Sally and so on. I think that it is the willingness of people who are what you might call on the inside of the process to ask themselves the question, who I'm bringing with me. And even if it's only one person at a time, and if you're careful about who you select, there's a real opportunity there for us to be building chains of people. Because I've had young women who've worked with me as policy officer in ERA who have done CSW, who have then themselves gone on to support other young women in the space. And I think that that's one critical way of doing it, if you're making the selection very carefully, because it's when you're trying to do that and you're committing time to it, and that time is resourcing, it's easy to make the choice part of it quick and easy. The nearby person, for me, it's always been an employee in the organisation. That's easy. It's someone who's been paid to do it. It's someone that I have at hand and with whom I have an existing relationship. But I think that there is also an important commitment that we need to be making to finding the people who wouldn't get there otherwise. And even if we're only taking on one each, then at least we are building a network who themselves may in turn be able to take people on. And I've seen YWCA's Australia's quite large delegations of 10 or so people, 10 or so young women and people of marginalised genders go on to become people who then themselves support others in the space. So yeah, and Juliana's just pointing up the funding requirement for that. And yeah, the Y does it by pulling on other women and seeking membership support to support those young women to go. And we can do that. We can organise that. So I think that that's definitely something we should be looking at. The other thing I'd just like to point out about the online space, which I think is critical to acknowledge, and this is particularly a barrier for young women, is that when it's in the online space, your day job doesn't end. The travel is nice and it's memorable and it puts you in the room with people and you build relationships, but it also means that you don't do your day job while CSW is happening because you're not in the country. And people don't understand that when you're sitting staring at a screen because it looks like you're at work normally. And I've got to go and watch something online is not a great excuse for not doing your day job. And so there's a real, I think there's a real work health and safety, personal safety issue for us in relation to participating in CSW in terms of our inability to switch off other things while it's happening. And I think we need to be aware of that and be noisy about it. One of the things we can do about raising the awareness of CSW is raising an awareness among people of the fact that this is something that needs to be done in preference to other things for a short period. I'll stop there.
Yeah. And Helen, I think there's some more thinking that we need to do in terms of thinking about how we would provide that kind of mentoring assistance in a completely online environment. So how would, for example, you provide support to Margarita when you're both sitting at home in the middle of the night watching the, side events? like what would that look like? So I think I'd commend that to ERA and the Y about thinking about how we might be able to build a process around that that's a little bit more than informal. And sorry, Carol.
No, I was just about to say, Jera International used to always take staff along as well and mentor, and they're still engaged and involved. And the part I was going to mention was what's coming up in the chat is it's the overall funding of it. To get funding to take someone from Australia to New York is extremely difficult. 9 times out of 10, many of us self-fund to go to New York and go into those spaces. And you get there and your colleagues have been fully funded to be there, and so you share their hotel room because their hotel room's paid for by somebody, and you're sleeping on the floor, and it gets a little bit in that direction. So I do think there's a need to really solidify a way, if when it opens up again, and I'm sure it'll be open again next year, is how do we do that preparation, and how do we give funding to that? Some organizations have got that, I know, but then there's the other side, and this is the other side we have to think of when we're talking about taking people to New York, and that's the accreditation side, because as I said in the earlier session, organizations have 20 spaces. So a global organization has 20 spaces. Accredited organizations have 20 spaces that they fill. Now, if you're a global organization, that can go very quickly. And so we have to also look at our own mechanisms and say, if we're taking 20 people, how many of those are going to be young people? And then how do we manage that within our own systems of organization? So it comes back to us as well.
I think that in terms of thinking about CSW and into the future, there's real room for us to think about how we can encourage government to put some funding into ensuring that civil society is able to engage from Australia remotely. I mean, it does make it a lot easier because it's more cost affordable. But how can we support government to, ask government to support civil society to build the next generation of young women engaged in CSW and international human rights processes in an online environment? It might be something that, Helen, I'd be happy to talk to you about, seeing if we could pitch for some funding to Office for Women post-election, and thinking about, and particularly if there's a new government, it might be a bit of breath of fresh air that they want to start off with something new. So in any event, there's not much point talking to them before an election. But I think maybe that's something that we could talk about as a way forward, that we really need to do more to build those pathways for young women and women who are otherwise often feeling excluded or are excluded. And I hear what Tony's saying. It's incumbent on NGOs in Australia to do some reimagining for change. Because we know that internationally the space for civil society is closing. And to pick up the point that Carol made earlier, civil society space had been closing already with CSW in its face-to-face before COVID environment. And, it had been happening since they started renovating the UN, remember, and they locked out all of the NGOs. And we all were worried, and I think that was about 2015, we were worried that was going to be difficult for NGOs to crack back open again. And it was, and then COVID hit. So now here we are in a situation where you really are seeing the language negotiated in advance of CSW by post, and even the capital, even the gender experts in the Office for Women are kind of largely excluded from it. It's a day-to-day piece of work by DFAT, and it's seen as just part of the geopolitics and horse trading that happens. So how do we use this process to encourage the Australian government to help at least Australian NGOs, but also more broadly other NGOs, to engage in this new world, so that we're not seeing this space closing? I think that's a real challenge for us, and I'd be really grateful to hear if we've got any thoughts. I know we're coming up for time now, Helen, but if anybody has any thoughts about how we can recreate that space for civil society into the future. Juliana, I can see you've got words.
No.
Okay.
This is where I haven't got words. Thank you.
Yeah, right. It's hard, isn't it? Yeah. And Tony, was that you saying gender responsive budgeting? Yes.
And can I just build on that a bit? ERA has had a go pitching previously to fill both the gaps that we've identified, which is the outreach consolidation, who leads the post-CSW piece, and the how do we get people to CSW piece. And it's met with some interest, at least partly because of that issue about turnover in OFW and DFAT, and the sense that government does periodically rely quite heavily on us as a repository of knowledge. And I think government is attracted to the idea that if they fund a repository of knowledge, then they get a little bit of a friendlier relationship with that repository of knowledge than if they rely on the rest of us. And so I've had nibbles about that in the past. I'd be very happy to pitch that again with anyone who wanted to get involved in that, because I think what we need is a funded position for somebody whose job is the domestic implementation and some of the corralling around CSW, but who can then also be doing that, who's not at the table, who needs to be at the table. Let's fund them work as well.
And I think we are coming up very close to time now, but I just wanted to pick up a point that Carol made and tie that into the point that you just made then, Helen, that there is the potential for government and civil societies to work together, civil society organisations to work together in a really trusting and coordinated fashion. And coming from government, when I left government and moved into the CSO space, one of the things that I often used to say to my colleagues in civil society was, never forget that public servants are people too. And sometimes, it's easy for NGOs to think that public servants don't care or aren't trying. And as Carol said, sometimes it is absolutely the case, quite often, it's absolutely the case that public servants are trying to do what they can. They can't always deliver everything that civil society leaders would like to see them deliver, but they are bloody well trying. I always was trying, and you know, you're going to get so far. It's really useful to remember that we're all standing in different positions, but we all have the same commitment to gender equality outcomes. It's civil society's job to lead us forward, isn't it? You know, and to provide us with the ambition and the expectations for greater steps forward. And it's up to government then to work the space as well as we can and make whatever change we can happen. Sometimes it's useful to know that civil society is going to be in the ear of their minister or their senior leaders, and that they'll be providing them with a bit of attention to give us more space internally. Thinking about, you know, the way that public servants really are trying, even if they don't necessarily are able to deliver everything that you're seeking, I think is really an important thing to remember, and celebrating when there are achievements, even if they're only small steps. I think these are really important things to do to build that trust and that relationship between public servants and civil society, and that public servants take that with them when they leave the position that they're in now and move into a new position. And if we can build, keep on building that relationship and that membrane between civil society and government, I think it's really important, because it's easy for public servants to forget that we're all working on this together and just to look at their own incentives to sort of work to their bosses. And I know that when I was in government, I would be as trusting as I could be there, and if I knew that people like Helen and Carol and others would know that if I couldn't tell you something, it wasn't because I was sitting on the information, it was because I couldn't tell you. I was telling you what I could, and when I trusted you with information, I never felt that I never felt that that trust was betrayed. So I think that's one of the things. You've got to know how to be a trustworthy partner to government. You know, if things are told to you in confidence, respect the confidence. I think that's really important, and recognise that the public servants are also trying. Those would be the thoughts I had. Did others have any other points that they'd like to make about how we work together with government?
I'd like to ask Vani Malia, is she still on from WIDA? Whether, oh, there you are, Mali. I'd like to sort of get, because Mali's been part of the conversations with the caucus that talk to the government at the moment, and you know, just reflecting on what you said, sometimes you feel a bit lost, sometimes you're not kind of with it. I would like to see that space have more, while it has to be, you know, a smaller space. I think you recognise that because of the nature of the discussions and the speed that those discussions take. You can't come in and start to ask questions. You're operating at a different level. I'm wondering, you know, one, do you feel supported in that space? What can we do to help you through that space? And what do you see in bringing others into that space where we are now? Because you're busy going through that process with us, right?
Yeah. Honestly, I think the best thing that could happen is doing a training day like this prior to CSW time, so not in March, like potentially doing this in November the year beforehand. Yeah. Because if I had done this training, for instance, when Kelly sent out the zero draft to all the National Women's Alliances, I had to email back and be like, "Hi, Kelly, can you explain what the zero draft is?" And when we had our meeting with Maris, I didn't really understand what the methods of work were, but I feel like I would have gained so much more from that meeting if I did understand after you explained this morning, Carol, what the methods of work were. So I think having training and deliberately investing in the training and mentoring outside of the like very short CSW window more would be really, really helpful. And I think too, yeah, like it is important to be in that space, and I, you know, feel more confident going into these spaces after this training. But also too, I feel confident that it contributes to our capacity building as an organisation at WIDA, for example. So like me and Heidi being able to learn these things, I'm sure would be of great comfort to Carolyn. So Carolyn, you know, knows that there's, yeah, that knowledge base being built as well. So yeah, I totally would recommend, even like if, and this is again another piece of work and it comes back to resourcing, right? But like so much of what's in these slides today would be great in like a 5 or 6 page PDF document that is like a glossary of language and terminology almost. And I know that there are like some apps out there made by different governments. I think, is it the Swiss government? I don't know.
There's actually a document out there that Australia did. Yeah. I wrote it, and then there was one on language that one of Helen's staff and myself tic-tacked on. So, and Juliana is currently writing one. Juliana and I are just about to draft another document. So there are documents there that fall in and out of, I mean, they need updating because of, you know, the different processes have changed. They change year to year, and I think post-COVID is going to be a great time to pull that in. And I think, Marley, we're going to be pulling on you to see, you know, some of the, you know, disability environments that can really enhance engagement as opposed to limit and hinder. But, you know, I hope you feel, Marley, that in that all of that group, and I'm going to speak for Alice here as well, because Alice has left the room, that you could talk to any of us about any of it at any time. And it was really cool being in the room with the UN last week, wasn't it?
It was very cool. It was very cool. I think the final thing that I maybe would suggest that I just thought of then is like, so I was part of the YWCA virtual delegation last year. I feel like I didn't really gain a lot, again because of like the time zone difference. But like having a training day like this specifically for young women, so you know, it was still Carol and everyone else kind of leading the discussions and mentoring us, but it was just, you know, me and Margarita and some of the other young women in the sector, as well as maybe like, you know, reaching out to some women and gender diverse people that we know kind of sit on that outlying kind of space of the sector, I think would be really useful too, because in doing that, that's also creating a network of young people for us, so that I can go away and like talk to Margarita, and like we can also be learning and mentoring each other as well, if that makes sense. I think yeah, and just to put a bit of context in that is, I think because I personally know Shilpa, who's in the UN office, and Alice knows the people in the office, they were talking more to us as a trust thing. It's coming back to what Sally was saying, is they know they can talk to us and it won't go, and they trust that whoever's in that room, we're bringing them in that room in that same way. And I think we'll take that on notice, because I think, sorry, I'll shut up. I see Helen's got her mouth.
There's some fabulous ideas in this space, and I've just been so impressed to see the popping of ideas emerging. I'm going to, with that, hand back over to Helen to make the point that you wanted to make with your hand up there, Helen, but also to finish us off for the afternoon. I'm happy to keep talking about the ideas and what I can do to help too. Thanks, everybody. I found it a really warm and beautiful conversation. So thank you all for your participation.
Thanks, Sally. Thanks so much for that. And so important for us to be able to access your very varied experience in this space. It's really helpful for us to have that voice in the room. I have my hand up because I want to say something that's going to feel like a bucket of cold water, but actually isn't. And that's because some of the confusion and the overwhelmedness and the I don't know what's going on feeling that people feel when they come into the space is because it is complicated and it is dense and it is actually difficult. And there's going to be a limit to the amount of simplification we can do. Because when we simplify too much, we run the real risk of starting to obscure some of the nuance. And that sounds like, you know, a semantic issue, but it's actually about obscuring the lived experiences of the lives of women whose experiences don't fit what you might think of as the mainstream. And so the language is dense and complicated and jargonistic because we are trying to encompass an awful lot in only a few words. And if we tried to not use jargon and we tried to not use defined terms, the documents would become unreadable very quickly. But what that means is that that idea that we need to be reaching out and bringing people not just into training sessions, but along the journey becomes critical, because learning CSW is a lifelong experience. I haven't finished. And I suspect that Carol and Sally and Juliana would also say that they haven't finished. I suspect that Claire Moore would say she's not finished. So we're all still learning. And I think I really like the talk that we're having about the idea that you build relationships from which you learn, and networks, as Molly was saying, from which you learn on an ongoing basis, I think is going to be critical.